began with a single woman. Her name has been remembered only in fragments, Frau Trophäa. But in the summer of 1518, in the bustling Alsatian city of Strasbourg, she stepped into a narrow street and began to dance. There was no music, no festival, no marriage feast or holy procession. She simply moved, arms jerking, feet stamping, skirts swirling in the dust. Passers-by stopped to watch, perplexed. At first, they might have thought it a jest, a fit of madness, or perhaps some eccentric devotion. But as the hours passed, the strangeness deepened. She did not stop. Through the afternoon, through the evening, even into the night, she moved. Sweat poured from her body. Her face contorted not in joy but in anguish. Her steps seemed less like celebration and more like compulsion, as though some invisible hand dragged her across the stones. By dawn she was still at it, and by the third day others had joined. Within a week, more than 30 townspeople had been seized by the same frenzy. They danced in the squares, in the markets, beneath the looming spires of Strasbourg Cathedral. Men and women, young and old, the healthy and the frail, all moving with the same terrible rhythm, a rhythm that no musician played, yet which none of them could resist. And the strangest part, they begged for help, but their bodies betrayed them. They cried that they wanted to stop, but their limbs ignored the plea. They stumbled, collapsed, bled at the feet, and yet as soon as they caught their breath, they rose again and continued. The authorities were aghast. Strasbourg was no stranger to hardship. Only a generation earlier, the city had been racked by famine. Disease was never far. The shadow of the Black Death still haunted memory. But this was no pestilence of sores or fever. This was something new, an affliction of the soul, a madness that seized the body and turned it into its own torturer. At first, the magistrates consulted physicians. Learned men peered at the dancers, muttered diagnoses in Latin, and finally gave their verdict. This was no plague of the flesh, but of the blood. The culprit, they claimed, was overheated humors. The cure? Not rest, not confinement, but more dancing. And so, in an act that today seems almost unbelievable, the city organized the madness. A stage was erected. Musicians were hired. Pipe and drum filled the air. The afflicted were gathered together as if the fever could be sweated out in the rhythm of the dance. For a time, the streets of Strasbourg looked like a festival gone terribly wrong. Hundreds swayed and spun, not with laughter but with grimaces of agony. Their feet blistered, their muscles tore, their hearts strained under the ceaseless movement. Eyewitnesses claimed some collapsed dead in the middle of the crowd, struck down by exhaustion, by stroke, by the sheer impossible demand placed on their bodies. Still, the dancing spread. Some accounts estimate as many as 400 people were swept into the plague. 400 souls, trapped in a nightmare of motion. The onlookers were torn between fascination and dread. Was this punishment from God, a curse of the devil, or perhaps the work of the saints, angry, neglected, demanding penance? Strasbourg, like much of Europe, lived in a world where divine wrath was not a metaphor, but a daily possibility. To many, there could be no other explanation. Heaven itself had seized the city and was shaking it to pieces. Priests thundered from pulpits. Some blamed the sins of the people, pride, gluttony, the growing tide of heresy that threatened Christendom in the wake of Martin Luther's rebellion, which had erupted only a year before. Others whispered that the dancers were witches, their frenzy the mark of a covenant with hell. Still others spoke of Saint Vitus, the saint to whom seizures and spasms were often attributed. Perhaps this was his dance, inflicted upon Strasbourg as a punishment for neglecting his shrine. The councillors, desperate to stem the tide, ordered the afflicted marched to the chapel of Saint Vitus in nearby Saverne. There priests placed them beneath holy relics, sprinkled them with consecrated water, and pressed crosses into their trembling hands. Some were cured, or at least some stopped moving. Others did not. Weeks passed. The plague burned itself through bodies and souls alike, and as suddenly as it began, it ebbed. By September, the fever had ended. The streets were quieter again, though scarred by memory, and by the countless dead who had danced themselves into the grave. But the questions remained. Why did it happen? What seized Frau Trophäa and the hundreds who followed her into that terrible dance? The people of Strasbourg believed they had glimpsed divine judgment or infernal mischief. And perhaps in their world, that explanation was enough. But to us, centuries later, the mystery only deepens. Some scholars have proposed ergot poisoning, the fungus that grows on rye, producing hallucinogenic compounds, the same that some believe played a role in the Salem witch trials. Could spoiled bread have filled Strasbourg's stomachs with visions and compulsions? Perhaps. Yet ergot usually convulses, not choreographs. Others suggest mass psychogenic illness, a collective hysteria born of stress, famine, and fear. Strasbourg in 1518 was a tinderbox of anxieties. Harvests had failed. Taxes pressed heavily. The spectre of religious upheaval loomed large. Perhaps the people, crushed by invisible burdens, found themselves released into visible madness. The body spoke what the tongue could not bear to say. And yet, the more we search for rational answers, the more elusive the truth becomes. For what rational answer can explain 400 souls dancing to death, without music, without joy, without end? The tale of the dancing plague endures not because it is solved, but because it resists solution. It is history's reminder that human beings are not creatures of reason alone. We are vulnerable to forces, psychological, spiritual, cultural, that defy neat categories. In July of 1518, Strasbourg saw its streets turned into a stage of horror, its people transformed into unwilling performers, its city made into an unwilling theater of the absurd. And though the curtain fell after 2 months, the echo of that dance has never been silenced. For it whispers still, that beneath our ordered lives, beneath the cobblestones of our cities, there lies a fragility we rarely acknowledge, that at any moment the rhythm of madness might seize us, and we too might find ourselves moving to a music no one else can hear. When the last bodies finally collapsed in silence, Strasbourg was left with more than corpses. It was left with scars. In the weeks after the plague ebbed, the survivors were not simply cured. Many remained shaken, their muscles weakened, their minds frayed. Some limped for the rest of their days, their joints ruined by the violence of their own movement. Others carried only the memory, a memory of compulsion so strong that they no longer trusted their own limbs. What if it returned? What if their bodies betrayed them again? The city itself bore the weight of shame. Strasbourg had been an imperial free city, proud of its autonomy, its markets, its cathedral that stretched toward heaven like a stone prayer. Yet what story would now be told of it? Not the prosperity of its merchants, nor the dignity of its guilds, but of a madness that turned its citizens into jesters of death. And stories did spread. Chroniclers wrote of the dance as though it were a visitation, a parable, a warning. Some softened the horror, transforming it into a tale of divine chastisement overcome by faith. Others leaned into the grotesque, painting Strasbourg as cursed, its people made into a laughingstock before all of Christendom. But beneath the chronicles ran a quieter truth. Fear. Fear that the madness might not be finished, because this was not the first time. Across the Rhine, in the decades before, other outbreaks of dancing plagues had been recorded. Cologne, 1374. Men and women leapt and convulsed in the streets until exhaustion felled them. Aachen, Metz, and even smaller villages had seen similar fits. Each time, priests attributed it to Saint Vitus or Saint John the Baptist. Each time, relics were paraded, shrines visited, penitential masses sung. And each time, the plague eventually faded, but only after it had run its course, like fire consuming dry wood. What distinguished Strasbourg was not that it happened, but that it happened so late, so violently, and on such a scale. The year 1518 was not an ordinary year. Europe stood on the threshold of a storm. Martin Luther had nailed his 95 Theses the year before, and the edifice of Christendom was beginning to crack. Rumors of heresy, reform, and schism circulated like wildfire. The peasantry seethed under crushing taxes. Crop failures had bred hunger, and hunger bred unrest. Strasbourg, straddling trade routes and religious fault lines alike, was a city under immense pressure. And in pressure, cracks appear. To modern eyes, what happened may seem like hysteria, a psychological epidemic born of stress and despair. And indeed, many scholars today believe the dancing plague was a form of mass psychogenic illness, where trauma and tension erupt through the body in unison. Yet even that explanation, clinical as it may sound, does not erase the awe. For how fragile must the human condition be, that the stresses of the world can turn into a storm of legs and arms, dragging hundreds to their deaths. The physicians of Strasbourg never admitted defeat. To them, the diagnosis of overheated blood was not wrong, only incomplete. They argued that the madness came from within, but was triggered by forces without. Some pointed to the heavens, to strange alignments of the stars, others to the earth, to vapors rising from the Rhine. But all agreed on one thing. This was not chance, it was meaning. And meaning was dangerous. The city council, perhaps fearing unrest more than plague, moved quickly to control the narrative. The dancers were not mocked, but pitied. They were not condemned, but treated as victims. Pilgrimages to Saverne were encouraged, offerings to St. Vitus collected. To name the plague as madness was acceptable. To suggest it as protest, as divine commentary on corruption or oppression, was not. Thus, the dancing plague of Strasbourg became folded into the fabric of religion. It became not a warning about social strain, but about obedience to heaven. If you doubted God, if you strayed from the saints, you might find yourself compelled to dance until your heart gave out. Centuries passed. The story endured. Some retold it as legend, stripping it of detail, turning it into a morality play. Others studied it as history, combing through the fragments of the archives for dates, names, numbers. The stage built in Strasbourg, the chapel in Saverne, the reports of 400 dancers, the handful of deaths recorded in tax rolls and burial registers. But the truth remains elusive. And perhaps that is what makes the tale of Strasbourg so haunting. Not just that it happened, but that it happened in a place so ordinary. This was not some forgotten hamlet in the woods. Strasbourg was a thriving city, proud, learned, connected to the heart of Europe. And yet even there, reason gave way to frenzy, and the body became its own executioner. The citizens who watched in horror in 1518 could not have known they were witnessing an event that would still be spoken of 500 years later. They could not have known that their city's name would be forever tied to a dance without music, a plague without fever. They only knew that something had passed through them, something they could not explain, could not control, and could not forget. And so we remember it too. We remember Frau Troffea stepping into the street in July, her feet compelled by a rhythm that no one else could hear. We remember the swelling crowd, the bodies spinning and collapsing, the priests leading processions to St. Vitus, the city council erecting stages in a desperate attempt to manage madness. We remember the strange combination of belief and bewilderment, fear and fascination. And above all, we remember the silence when it ended. For in that silence lies the most unsettling truth, that human life, ordered and rational as we may think it, can at any moment break into chaos, that the mind and the body can betray us, that the city, proud and strong, can dissolve into frenzy in the space of a heartbeat. It is a reminder as old as Strasbourg, and as fresh as our own anxieties. We are never as stable as we believe. The dancing plague of 1518 is not just a story of the past, it is a mirror, showing us what we are capable of, when fear, hunger, faith, and despair weave together into something no wall, no law, no council can contain. And if it happened once, we must always wonder, could it happen again?